Yellowstone and its many spin-offs are some of the most popular shows on TV right now. If you grew up watching Rawhide, Dallas, or Deadwood, then the franchise's gritty neo-Western aesthetic and complex characters are incredibly interesting to watch. But its universe is constantly spreading its roots, and it suffers from what we like to call a chaotic timeline that doesn't make much sense anymore. So, today, let's check out the pitfalls of Yellowstone's confusing timeline. First, the problem with Beth's forced sterilization. When we watched Cowboys and Dreamers for the first time, we didn't expect Beth and Jamie's backstory to hit me like a bucking thoroughbred. The emotional impact of the episode left thousands of fans devastated. A lot of them vented their feelings on social media, as you would with any heartbreak. And the best part about the entire revelation was Kelly Riley's jaw-dropping performance. She was mesmerizing and had everyone hooked to their screens. But before we explain the problem with her forced sterilization, here's a quick recap of what happened. When she was a teenager, she got pregnant with Rip's child and didn't want to keep it. So she turned to the person she trusted the most at the time, her older brother Jamie. He took her to an abortion clinic just outside town, but the show made it clear that it was a clinic specifically for Indigenous people. When the clinic staff tells him that if Beth goes through with the procedure, she'll be required to undergo sterilization, he agrees. He takes her in and doesn't tell her about it. This is incredibly dark, even for Yellowstone, but it has a purpose. In the 60s and 70s, it was common for federally funded abortion clinics to forcefully sterilize Indigenous people and people of color. In fact, it was a Supreme Court decision in 1927 that let any state sterilize a person if they weren't fit for procreation. It was a shocking and disturbing practice that continued all the way to the 60s and 70s. It sounds like it's straight out of a sci-fi novel. But you know what they say about reality being stranger than fiction, right? Anyway, we're glad that Taylor Sheridan decided to shed light on one of the most unethical medical practices that happened in the United States. But here's the problem. The show's timeline is completely off. We know that she was 16 years old when Jamie took her to the clinic, but it wouldn't have been possible for the doctors or staff to sterilize her without telling her about it. Forced sterilizations were outlawed in the late 1970s, and if we assume that that's when Beth got hers, then she should be in her 60s by the time Yellowstone starts in 2017. Now, there's certain nuances about this topic that we need to dig into. For example, California continued the practice for female prison inmates up until 2014. That's when the state finally passed a law that banned sterilizations for birth control purposes. Yep, the Golden State allowed inhumane acts on female prisoners as recently as 2014. On the other hand, illegal sterilizations happen across the country to this day. So the show has some leeway in that regard, but the problem of Beth's age still stands. How can she be 16 years old at the time of her legal sterilization? She was 38 when the series began, which means she was 16 in 1995, not the 1970s when the Indian Health Service forcefully sterilized Indigenous women. In the 1990s, any abortion clinic in the world would have asked Beth permission before doing a life-altering procedure like that. The only explanation that makes sense is that the clinic they went to was operating illegally. It wasn't following procedure, and it didn't care how many women it forcefully sterilized. And, in a way, it makes sense for the reality we sadly live in. Yellowstone shows dark and tragic things like that are still happening in the U.S. John Dutton's military career. The next timeline issue is John Dutton's military career. What military career, you ask? Well, there's an interview where Kevin Costner says that John's a Vietnam vet, and that the horrors of war are a tragedy that the Dutton family suffers every generation. That's a huge statement, and from the way John behaves throughout the series, you'd think he's definitely had some experience in the war. He's gruff, battle-hardened, and tough as nails. He speaks volume with few words. He played Superman's dad in Man of Steel. Okay, that last one's a joke. But you get what I'm saying, right? There's a reason why older audiences, specifically older men, love tuning into it every week. They can relate to what he's going through. He's simply an old patriarch that's too tired and too exhausted to keep his family ranch competing with a changing world. But he'll do it anyway. And maybe his experience in the Vietnam War is what helps him push forward constantly and overcome every obstacle in his path. That sounds lovely. But here's the problem. John was born in 1959, and the Vietnam War began in 1955. This means that John was 16 years old by the time the war ended in 1975. And we don't think he lied about his age and went overseas to fight while the Dutton Ranch was left vulnerable to outsiders. Now, you'd imagine that teenagers wouldn't get drafted into the military, but that happened more often than you'd think. Teens lied about their age all the time. In fact, one of the youngest servicemen to die in combat was Dan Bullock, born in 1953. He altered his date of birth when he was 14 years old and got recruited into the U.S. Marine Corps, and sadly, he died 1 year later at age 15. The series has some leeway here too. Like it does with Beth's age during her forced sterilization, John could have lied about his age and went to war. Or the other explanation is that he wasn't in the Vietnam War in the first place because the timeline wouldn't match with his current age. What can happen is that he was somehow involved in the Cold War, which lasted until 1991. That's plenty of time for him to grow up, help out on the ranch, and be of service to his country. The problems with Yellowstone's timeline so far have been tiny. But wait for it. We're about to enter the real chaotic timeline that Kevin Feige would be proud of. The expanding and confusing character relationships. Ah yes, the ever-expanding Yellowstone universe. Listen, everyone loves a good spin-off. Better Call Saul, Boston Legal, Star Trek The Next Generation. But Taylor kickstarted a universe that rivals the likes of CW's Arrowverse, 1883 and 1923, the upcoming Bass Reef story, and 6666. And there's 2 more spin-offs currently in development. The first is a Yellowstone sequel series starring Matthew McConaughey, and the other is a Yellowstone prequel series set in the 1960s, presumably showcasing John's childhood and how he may have served in the military. Oh, and there's also 1944, yet another prequel set after the events of 1923. Phew! Those are a lot of prequels, sequels, and side quests to keep up with. And it's only understandable that fans now find it really hard to keep up with the Dutton lineage. Taylor loves moving back and forth between the timelines and adding flashbacks every now and then to flesh out the Dutton storyline. But it only ends up confusing everyone. Even the stars are confused. James Badge Dale and Isabel May shared their utter confusion about the ever-growing Dutton family tree recently. James joked about it with Harrison Ford because none of them could figure out how they were related to Costner's John Dutton, who's actually John Dutton III. In 1923, Sheridan introduced a whole new generation of Duttons, including James Dutton's older brother Jacob and his eldest son, John Dutton Sr. You'd think John III's related to Sr., but that's not true. He dies in the first episode, leaving behind his only son, Jack. And as far as we know right now, Jack's not John III's great-grandfather. Confused yet? We know, we are too. And it's okay. You see, the problem is 1923's first season never resolved whether it's Jack or Spencer, James's second son, who continues the Dutton legacy. Elsa says in her Beyond the Grave voiceover that only one of James's kids helped the family in the future, and since both she and John Sr. are dead, and Jack is James's grandson, then it stands to reason that Spencer is the child that continued the Dutton family tree. 1923's been renewed for a second season, so we'll hopefully get more answers soon. But as of now, the Dutton family's timeline is incredibly nonsensical. Like Isabel said, you could spend your time theorizing. All the power to you. I'd rather just be told. What do you think? Tell us your thoughts and theories in the comments below. And like and subscribe to this channel for more Yellowstone content like this.